January 29th, 1945, 2:47 p.m., Holzheim, Belgium. Sergeant Walter Mitchell's hands trembled on the controls of his M4 Sherman as he watched the tree line ahead. His breath formed small clouds inside the cramped turret, but it wasn't the cold making him shake. Through the periscope, he saw it emerge from the forest like a prehistoric monster awakening from slumber. A tiger. 800 meters away, its massive 88mm gun was already traversing toward his position. "Gunner, target, 12 o'clock, Mitchell screamed. Private First Class. Tommy Rodriguez, barely 20 years old, pressed his eye against the gun sight. His voice cracked when he spoke. "I see him, Sarge. But at this range, our shells won't even scratch him." Mitchell knew Rodriguez was right. They had exactly 4 seconds to decide. Fight and almost certainly die, or run and possibly survive. 4 seconds that felt like an eternity. 4 seconds that represented everything wrong with American tank doctrine in World War II. The Tiger's gun stopped moving. It was pointed directly at them. "Driver reverse, now, now." The Sherman lurched backward just as the world exploded in fire and thunder. The 88mm shell screamed past, missing by inches, and detonated against a stone wall behind them. Debris rained down on the tank's hull. They were alive, for now. But as Mitchell's Sherman retreated behind a farmhouse, he couldn't shake one terrifying thought. They would have to face that monster again, and next time, they might not be so lucky. This was the reality for thousands of American tankers during World War II. The Tiger tank had become a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Its very presence on a battlefield could paralyze entire armored units. But here's what most people don't know. While the Tiger I was indeed a nightmare for American Shermans, on the Eastern Front, Soviet tank crews had found a way to turn the hunter into the hunted. They had developed a weapon and tactics that made the mighty Tiger vulnerable, even easy prey. The IS-2. If you find stories like this fascinating, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more incredible stories from history, and we have so much more to share. Now, let me take you back to understand how we got here, how a tank that terrorized one front became vulnerable on another, and what this tells us about the nature of warfare itself. The story of the Tiger. It begins not on a battlefield, but in a factory. And it begins with one man's obsession with creating the ultimate weapon. In 1937, the German army issued a specification for a new heavy tank. They wanted something unprecedented, a vehicle that could destroy any enemy tank at ranges where return fire would be ineffective. They wanted armor thick enough to be essentially invincible to standard anti-tank weapons. They wanted, in essence, a land battleship. What they didn't anticipate was how this obsession with invincibility would eventually become the Tiger's greatest weakness. Henschel and Porsche, two of Germany's industrial giants, competed for the contract. The designs were radically different. Porsche's version used an innovative electric drive system. Henschel's was more conventional, but also more practical. Adolf Hitler, who took a personal interest in tank development, initially favored the Porsche design. He loved its technological sophistication. But there was a problem. The Porsche Tiger was mechanically unreliable. During trials, it broke down constantly. The electric motors overheated, the complex transmission failed. Ferdinand Porsche was so confident his design would win that he had already ordered this production of 90 chassis. When Henschel won the contract instead, those chassis were converted into the Ferdinand tank destroyer, which would later prove equally problematic. But that's a story for another time. The Henschel Tiger entered production in August 1942, and from the very beginning it was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The statistics alone were staggering. The Tiger I weighed 57 tons. To put that in perspective, a Sherman weighed 33 tons. The British Churchill, one of the heaviest Allied tanks, weighed 40 tons. The Tiger dwarfed them all. Its frontal armor was 100 millimeters thick, sloped slightly to increase effective thickness. The side armor was 80 millimeters. This was at a time when most tanks had frontal armor of 50 to 75 millimeters. But the armor wasn't what made the Tiger truly terrifying. It was the gun. The 88mm KWK 36L56 was derived from the famous Flak 88, an anti-aircraft gun that German crews had discovered was devastatingly effective against tanks during the North African campaign. The tank version was even more refined. At 1,000 meters, the Tiger's 88 could penetrate 138 millimeters of armor with standard ammunition. With tungsten core rounds, which were increasingly rare as the war progressed, it could penetrate even more. Let me put that number in context. The Sherman's frontal armor was approximately 75 millimeters thick. This meant the Tiger could destroy a Sherman from nearly 2 kilometers away, well beyond the range where the Sherman's 75mm gun posed any threat to the Tiger's armor. One German Tiger ace, Otto Carius, described it this way: "It was like fighting with a long sword against an opponent armed with a knife. We could strike them before they could reach us." But how did the Tiger become the terror of the Western Front? The answer lies in a combination of factors: the tank itself, German tactical doctrine, and perhaps most importantly, the psychological impact it had on Allied troops. The first Tigers appeared in combat in September 1942 near Leningrad. The terrain was swampy and unsuitable for heavy tanks. Several Tigers broke down or became stuck. The debut was inauspicious. But the Germans learned quickly. By late 1942 and into 1943, Tiger battalions had developed sophisticated tactics that maximized their advantages. They would position their tanks at long range, using the 88's superior accuracy and penetration to pick off enemy vehicles before they could close the distance. When American Shermans first encountered Tigers in Tunisia in late 1942, the results were shocking. During one engagement near Fide Pass in February 1943, a German counterattack led by Tigers caught American forces completely off guard. In just a few hours, the Germans destroyed over 40 American tanks and armored vehicles. The Tigers leading the assault suffered minimal damage. The survivors told stories that spread like wildfire through the Allied armies. "Our shells just bounced off. We hit him 5 times. Nothing happened. He was so far away we could barely see him, but he hit us on the first shot." These accounts, repeated and embellished, created something unprecedented in armored warfare: Tiger fear. The psychological impact of the Tiger cannot be overstated. Allied intelligence officers began receiving reports that dramatically overestimated the number of Tigers the Germans possessed. Crews reported seeing Tigers when they had actually encountered other German tanks, like the Panzer IV or the Stücki assault gun. A British intelligence report from 1944 noted dryly, "The Tiger tank has achieved a psychological effect out of all proportion to its actual numbers." At its peak, Germany never had more than about 1,350 Tiger I tanks in total production. Compare that to the over 49,000 Shermans produced during the war. Yet the Tiger's reputation made it seem like they were everywhere. And for the crews who did encounter them, the reputation was entirely justified. Consider what American tankers faced. The Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at any combat range at all. The only chance was to hit the sides or rear, where the armor was thinner. But the Tiger's crew knew this. They would always try to keep their frontal armor facing the enemy. The Sherman crews developed desperate tactics. One method was called swarming. The idea was simple but brutal: attack with multiple Shermans from different directions, hoping that while the Tiger engaged some, others could maneuver to hit the flanks or rear. The mathematics were grim. American commanders estimated it took 5 Shermans to destroy 1 Tiger. But that ratio, while often quoted, obscured a darker truth. It wasn't that 5 Shermans working together could reliably defeat a Tiger. It was that you needed 5 Shermans, because 4 of them would likely be destroyed in the process. "And we knew the odds," recalled one Sherman platoon leader who fought in France. "We knew that if we ran into a Tiger, most of us wouldn't make it. But we also knew we couldn't just let it sit there, destroying everything in sight. Someone had to stop it. We just hoped we'd be the lucky ones." This was the reality of fighting Tigers with Shermans: sacrifice. Young men in their late teens and early 20s, sitting in 33 tons of American steel, knowing that the enemy they faced could kill them from distances where they couldn't fight back, knowing that their best hope was to get close enough for a shot at the sides, which meant driving toward a gun that could destroy them with a single hit. The fear was rational. The courage required to overcome it was extraordinary. But here's where the story takes a turn that most people don't expect. While American tankers struggled against the Tiger, developing tactics of desperation and sacrifice halfway around the world on the frozen steppes of Russia, a different story was unfolding. The Soviets had also faced the Tiger. They had also experienced its terrifying power. But their response was different. They didn't try to fight the Tiger with what they had. They built something new, something better: the IS-2. Now, to understand why the IS-2 was so effective against the Tiger, we first need to understand what the Soviets learned from their own disastrous encounters with German heavy armor. When the Tiger first appeared on the Eastern Front in late 1942, the Soviets were just as shocked as their Western allies would later be. Their standard medium tank, the T-34, had been the best all-around tank in the world when it debuted in 1941. Its sloped armor, powerful gun, and excellent mobility had given German tankers nightmares. But against the Tiger, the T-34 was outmatched. The T-34's 76mm gun could only penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at point-blank range, essentially suicide distance. Soviet tankers adopted the same desperate swarming tactics that American crews would later use. But the Soviet leadership, brutal and pragmatic as always, recognized something that American planners did not fully appreciate until later in the war. They needed a tank killer. Not a general-purpose medium tank like the T-34 or the Sherman, not a tank designed for infantry support and exploitation of breakthroughs. They needed a vehicle specifically designed to destroy Tigers and Panthers at long range. The development of what would become the IS-2 began in 1943. The IS stood for Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator. Naming the tank after Stalin was partly propaganda, but it also reflected the priority the Soviet leadership placed on the project. The IS-2's design philosophy was radically different from the Sherman's. While the Sherman was designed for mass production, reliability, and versatility, the IS-2 was designed for one purpose: to kill the most heavily armored German tanks at maximum range. The key was the gun. The IS-2 mounted a 122mm A-19 gun, originally designed as a corps-level artillery piece. It fired a shell weighing 25 kilograms, compared to the Tiger's 88mm shell at about 10 kilograms. The physics were devastating. At 1,000 meters, the IS-2's armor-piercing shell could penetrate approximately 150 millimeters of armor. At 500 meters, it could penetrate over 160 millimeters. Remember the Tiger's frontal armor? 100 millimeters. For the first time, the Germans faced a tank that could reliably penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at combat ranges. The psychological advantage that Tiger crews had enjoyed was suddenly reversed. Soviet tank commander Dmitry Loza recalled his first engagement with a Tiger in his IS-2. "We knew we could hurt him. We knew that if we hit him, he would burn. This knowledge changed everything. We were no longer afraid." But it wasn't just the gun that made the IS-2 effective. The Soviets had studied German tactics carefully. They understood that the Tiger's strength lay in long-range engagement, where its superior optics and gun accuracy gave it an advantage. So they developed tactics to negate these advantages. Soviet IS-2 units rarely operated alone. They worked in coordination with T-34s, infantry, and aircraft. The T-34s would engage German tanks, drawing their attention, while IS-2s maneuvered to firing positions. When an IS-2 fired, the effect was often dramatic. One German tanker who survived an encounter with IS-2s described the impact. "The shell hit our Tiger on the turret front. There was a tremendous explosion. The turret was penetrated completely. 3 of my crew were killed instantly. I only survived because I was partially out of the hatch." The 122mm shell didn't just penetrate armor. When it did penetrate, the massive explosive charge inside created catastrophic damage. Tigers hit by IS-2 rounds often exploded, their ammunition cooking off in spectacular and fatal fireballs. But here's what made the IS-2 truly deadly. It exposed the Tiger's fundamental vulnerabilities. The Tiger had been designed when German planners assumed they would always have technological superiority. Its armor was thick, but not well sloped. Against the 75mm guns of early war Allied tanks, this didn't matter much. Raw thickness was enough. Against the IS-2's 122mm gun, slope became critical, and the Tiger's relatively flat armor surfaces were easier to penetrate than the more modern designs would have been. The Tiger also had serious mechanical issues that the IS-2 could exploit. The Tiger's massive weight, 57 tons, put enormous strain on its transmission and suspension. Breakdowns were common. A Tiger that broke down in combat was a sitting duck for IS-2 crews. One Soviet tactic involved deliberately targeting Tigers during movement, when they were most likely to throw a track or experience mechanical failure. An immobilized Tiger could be destroyed at leisure. The numbers tell the story. German tank losses on the Eastern Front were staggering. Between 1943 and 1945, the Germans lost approximately 6,200 tanks of all types on the Eastern Front. Many of these were destroyed by IS-2s and other Soviet heavy tanks and tank destroyers. Tiger crews who had felt invincible against T-34s suddenly found themselves vulnerable. The confidence that had made them deadly was shaken. Otto Carius, the same German ace who had compared fighting Shermans to using a longsword against a knife, had a different view of the IS-2. When we saw the Stalin tanks, we knew we had to be very careful. Their gun could kill us from any direction. We could no longer simply sit and wait for the enemy to come to us. But why did the IS-2 succeed where the Sherman struggled? The answer reveals something fundamental about the different approaches the Western Allies and Soviets took to warfare. The United States had chosen a strategy of mass production and standardization. The Sherman was designed to be built in enormous numbers, easily maintained and shipped across the Atlantic. Upgrading its gun to match the Tiger would have required redesigning the turret, disrupting production lines, and creating logistical complications. American planners believed, with some justification, that air power and artillery would deal with heavy German tanks. Tanks were for exploitation and pursuit, not for slugging matches with fortified positions. This wasn't entirely wrong. American tactical air power was devastatingly effective against German armor. P-47 Thunderbolts with rockets and bombs destroyed thousands of German vehicles during the Normandy campaign and beyond. But it meant that when Sherman crews did encounter Tigers, they were at a severe disadvantage. The Soviets had no such constraints. Soviet industry was massive and could accommodate multiple tank designs. Soviet logistics, while crude, were simplified by the shorter distances involved. And Soviet military doctrine emphasized concentration of force at decisive points. When the Soviets identified the Tiger as a threat, they responded with characteristic ruthlessness. They designed a tank specifically to kill Tigers, produced it in sufficient numbers, and developed tactics to use it effectively. The IS-2's gun wasn't designed to be versatile. It was designed to penetrate armor. Its low rate of fire, about 2 to 3 rounds per minute compared to the Sherman's 20 rounds per minute, didn't matter when one hit was usually enough. The IS-2's armor, while not as thick as the Tiger's in absolute terms, was more cleverly arranged. The hull front was heavily sloped, giving it excellent protection. The turret was cast in a rounded shape that deflected shells. When a Tiger and an IS-2 met in combat, the outcome often depended on who fired first. But unlike the Sherman, the IS-2 crew knew that if they hit, the Tiger would likely be destroyed. This confidence made them more aggressive, more willing to close the range, more dangerous. But there's another factor that doesn't often get discussed in accounts of tank warfare: the human element. By 1944, when IS-2s began appearing in large numbers, German tank crews were increasingly inexperienced. The veterans who had dominated the early years of the war had been killed or wounded. Replacement crews had less training and less combat experience. Soviet crews, meanwhile, had been fighting constantly since 1941. The survivors were hardened veterans who understood tank warfare intimately. They knew how to use terrain, how to coordinate with infantry, how to exploit enemy weaknesses. One IS-2 commander described his approach: "We never fought alone. We always had scouts, infantry, everything working together. The Germans thought their Tigers made them invincible. We showed them they were wrong." This brings us to a crucial point about the Tiger's reputation. The Tiger was indeed a formidable weapon. Its statistics were impressive. In certain circumstances, particularly when fighting defensive battles at long range against inferior opposition, it was devastating. But the Tiger was also a product of German strategic mistakes. Germany couldn't afford to build heavy tanks in large numbers. Each Tiger required enormous amounts of material and labor. Maintenance was a constant challenge. Spare parts were scarce. Fuel increasingly was unavailable. A Tiger that ran out of fuel or broke down was worth nothing. And as the war progressed, more and more Tigers were abandoned by their crews rather than lost in combat. The Soviets and Americans, with their superior industrial capacity, could accept higher tank losses because they could replace them. Germany could not. In this sense, the Tiger represented a fundamental flaw in German strategic thinking: the belief that quality could overcome quantity. Against the Shermans on the Western Front, this seemed to work. The Tiger's technological advantages were maximized by the terrain, by German defensive positions, and by the Allies' reluctance to accept the casualties necessary to swarm Tigers with Shermans. Against the IS-2 on the Eastern Front, the equation was different. The Soviets had developed a weapon that matched the Tiger's quality while maintaining the numerical advantage that their production capacity allowed. Let me take you back to the battlefield to show you what this meant in practice. March 1945, somewhere in Hungary. A column of 3 Tiger One tanks moved cautiously along a road lined with burned-out vehicles. The crews were veterans, survivors of countless engagements, but they were also exhausted, low on ammunition, and increasingly aware that the war was lost. The column commander, a Hauptmann with the Iron Cross, scanned the tree line through his cupola. Something didn't feel right. The road ahead passed through a narrow defile between 2 low hills, perfect ambush terrain. But they had no choice. Their orders were to reinforce a defensive position 3 kilometers ahead. There was no alternative route. "All tanks, increase speed," he ordered. "We'll push through quickly." The Tigers accelerated, their massive engines roaring. They were halfway through the defile when the first IS-2 shell hit. The lead Tiger exploded in a column of fire. The 122mm round had penetrated the turret, detonating the ammunition stored inside. The crew had no chance. The Hauptmann's Tiger swerved left, trying to find cover. His gunner was already traversing the turret, searching for the source of the fire. "I see him," the gunner shouted. "Right side, 300 meters. The Hauptmann saw it too, the distinctive shape of an IS-2 partially concealed behind a ruined barn. "Fire!" The 88mm shell streaked toward the Soviet tank. It struck the turret and ricocheted off the rounded armor. The Hauptmann felt his blood run cold. At 300 meters, with a clear shot at the turret, his shell had bounced. The IS-2 fired again. The shell hit the Tiger's hull front, just below the turret ring. The armor held, barely, but the impact was like being hit by a giant hammer. The driver was knocked unconscious. The tank lurched to a stop. Behind them, the third Tiger was engaging a second IS-2 that had appeared on the opposite side of the road. The Soviet tank's first shot missed. The Tiger's return fire hit the IS-2's tracks, immobilizing it. But even immobilized, the IS-2 was dangerous. Its gun traversed toward the stationary Tiger. At this range, it couldn't miss. The Hauptmann made a decision. "Abandon tank! Everyone out!" He threw open his hatch and scrambled onto the hull. Around him, his crew was doing the same. They sprinted toward a drainage ditch as the IS-2 fired. The 122mm shell penetrated the Tiger's engine compartment. The fuel tanks ignited. The tank that had seemed so invincible erupted in flames. From the ditch, the Hauptmann watched his Tiger burn. Beside him, his loader was sobbing. Their world was ending, one tank at a time. The IS-2 that had killed his tank was already backing away, its mission accomplished. It had destroyed 2 Tigers in less than 2 minutes without suffering significant damage. This was the reality of Tiger versus IS-2 combat by 1945. The Tiger's advantages, its thick armor and powerful gun, had been neutralized. What remained was just another tank, crewed by exhausted men fighting a losing war. But let's go back and examine why the Sherman crews didn't have the same weapon. The United States Army did eventually field a tank destroyer capable of threatening the Tiger, the M36 Jackson. Its 90mm gun could penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at reasonable combat ranges. But the M36 was lightly armored, designed for defensive ambush tactics rather than direct tank versus tank combat. It was a stopgap, not a solution. More significantly, the United States Army never fully embraced the concept of the heavy tank. There were reasons for this. American doctrine emphasized combined arms warfare, where tanks worked with infantry, artillery, and aircraft. The idea of building a tank specifically to fight other tanks seemed unnecessarily specialized. There were also logistical concerns. Heavy tanks were difficult to transport across the Atlantic. They strained bridges and roads designed for lighter vehicles. They consumed more fuel, which had to be shipped thousands of miles from American refineries. And there was bureaucratic inertia. The Sherman worked well enough in most situations. Upgrading to a heavier tank would mean retooling factories, retraining crews, and disrupting supply chains. The war would be won before such changes could take effect. This reasoning wasn't wrong, exactly. The United States did win the war. Air power and artillery did prove effective against German armor. The Sherman's versatility and reliability were genuine advantages. But it meant that individual Sherman crews paid a price that might have been avoided. If the Americans had deployed something equivalent to the IS-2 in 1944, how many young men might have survived who instead died in burning Shermans? We can't know the answer. History doesn't allow for counterfactuals, but it's worth considering. The Soviets faced similar logistical challenges and similar industrial constraints. They chose to build a heavy tank anyway. They accepted the costs because they judged the benefits to be worth it. The Americans made a different choice. Both choices reflected the strategic realities and cultural assumptions of the nations that made them. Neither choice was objectively right or wrong. They were simply different approaches to the same problem. But for the men in the Shermans, facing Tigers across the hedgerows of Normandy, the philosophical justifications meant nothing. They faced an enemy they couldn't kill in a tank that couldn't protect them because decisions made thousands of miles away had determined their fate. That's the nature of war. Individual soldiers rarely control the weapons they're given or the enemies they face. They can only do their best with what they have. And what the Sherman crews had was courage. Consider the story of Sergeant Lafayette Poole. Poole was a Sherman tank commander with the 3rd Armored Division. Between June and September 1944, his tank, named In the Mood, was credited with destroying 258 enemy vehicles, including many tanks and armored vehicles. Poole's success came not from superior firepower, but from superior tactics and sheer audacity. He would close rapidly with enemy vehicles, using speed and terrain to get into flanking positions where his 75mm gun could be effective. Against Tigers, Poole's tactics were particularly dangerous, but he understood something that many commanders didn't. The Tiger's turret traversed slowly. A fast-moving Sherman could sometimes get around to the side before the Tiger's gun could track it. "You had to be aggressive," Poole said after the war. "If you sat back and let them engage you at range, you were dead. Your only chance was to get in close and hit them where it hurt." Poole's luck ran out in September 1944 when his tank was hit by a German shell. He lost his leg but survived the war. His story illustrates both the possibilities and the limitations of Sherman tactics against Tigers. Skill and courage could overcome technological disadvantage, but only up to a point. Eventually, the odds caught up with even the best crews. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, IS-2 crews faced different challenges. The 122mm gun, for all its power, had significant drawbacks. Its low rate of fire meant that a missed first shot could be fatal. The ammunition was heavy and awkward to handle, making reloading slow and exhausting. Soviet IS-2 crews developed their own tactics to compensate. One common approach was to fire from ambush, destroy one enemy tank, then relocate before firing again. This reduced the vulnerability created by the slow reload time. Another tactic involved coordinating IS-2s in pairs. While one tank fired, the other watched for targets. When the first tank began reloading, the second would engage any threats. "We learned to work together," one IS-2 commander recalled. "One tank alone was vulnerable during reload. Two tanks covering each other were deadly." Soviet infantry also played a crucial role. In urban combat, infantry would identify enemy tank positions and guide IS-2s to firing positions. The infantry would then protect the tank during its vulnerable reload period. This combined arms approach was more sophisticated than the crude swarming tactics used against Tigers earlier in the war. It reflected the institutional learning that the Soviet military had undergone since the disasters of 1941. By 1945, the Red Army was arguably the most experienced and tactically proficient military force in the world. Its soldiers had learned their craft through years of brutal combat against the Wehrmacht. The German soldiers they faced, meanwhile, were increasingly green replacements who lacked the training and experience of their predecessors. This human dimension was as important as the technological one. A Tiger crewed by veterans was still a formidable opponent, but a Tiger crewed by 18-year-olds with a few weeks of training was a target. The same Tiger that would have dominated a battlefield in 1943 was vulnerable in 1945, not just because of the IS-2's firepower, but because the men inside were no longer the elite warriors they once had been. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the Tiger's story. Technology matters in warfare. A tank with a better gun, better armor, better optics will have advantages over one without these things. But technology alone doesn't win wars. Production capacity matters. The ability to build thousands of tanks, to replace losses, to sustain operations over months and years, proved more important than the ability to build a few hundred superior machines. Logistics matters. A Tiger without fuel or ammunition was worthless. As Germany's supply situation deteriorated, many Tigers were abandoned by their crews simply because they couldn't operate them anymore. Training matters. The quality of the crews determines how effectively the technology is used. As Germany's pool of experienced tankers shrank, the Tiger's effectiveness declined even though the tank itself was unchanged. And morale matters. A crew that believes it can win will fight differently than one that believes defeat is inevitable. By 1945, German tankers knew the war was lost. This knowledge sapped their fighting spirit in ways that no technological advantage could overcome. The Tiger was a remarkable achievement of German engineering. It represented the pinnacle of heavy tank design in the early 1940s. In the right circumstances, with the right crew, it was nearly unstoppable. But it was also a product of strategic overreach. Germany built Tigers because German leaders believed that technological superiority could compensate for numerical inferiority. They were wrong. The Sherman was not as impressive as the Tiger. It couldn't match the German tank in a straight fight, but there were enough Shermans to absorb losses and keep fighting. There was enough fuel and ammunition to keep them operating. There were enough trained crews to man them. And ultimately, that mattered more than any specification sheet. The IS-2 represented a third approach. The Soviets recognized that sometimes you do need a tank killer, a weapon specifically designed to destroy enemy armor. They built one without abandoning the mass production philosophy that had served them well. The IS-2 wasn't perfect. Its slow rate of fire and limited ammunition capacity were significant weaknesses, but it was good enough to counter the Tiger, and that was what mattered. Let me return one more time to Sergeant Walter Mitchell, whom we met at the beginning of this story. After his narrow escape from the Tiger at Holzheim, Mitchell's Sherman platoon was reinforced and sent back into the line. Over the following weeks, they would encounter German armor several more times. Mitchell developed his own tactics for dealing with Tigers. He learned to use terrain obsessively, never approaching through open ground. He coordinated closely with infantry, who could spot concealed German tanks before they fired. He requested air support whenever possible, even for minor engagements. "We adapted," he said years later. "We had to. The alternative was dying." In late February 1945, Mitchell's platoon encountered a Tiger in a small French village. The German tank was positioned at the end of a narrow street, covering the only approach. A frontal assault would be suicide. But Mitchell had learned the local terrain over weeks of fighting. He knew about a narrow alley that ran behind the houses on the right side of the street. While one Sherman provided distraction by firing smoke rounds, Mitchell led 2 tanks through the alley. The passage was so tight that they scraped paint off both sides of the holes. They emerged behind and to the right of the Tiger. At this range, from this angle, even a Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate. 3 Shermans fired simultaneously. The Tiger was hit multiple times in the engine compartment and turret side. It burst into flames. No German crew members escaped. Mitchell felt no triumph. They were just soldiers like us, he reflected. They were doing their job. We were doing ours. That's all it was. But he also felt something else. Relief. One more Tiger destroyed meant his men were a little safer. One more obstacle overcome meant they were a little closer to going home. This was how the war was won on the Western Front. Not through dramatic tank duels or technological breakthroughs, but through the slow, grinding accumulation of small victories. Shermans that shouldn't have been able to defeat Tigers found ways to do it anyway, through courage and cleverness and luck. Some historians have criticized American tank doctrine. They argue that the Army should have prioritized upgrading Sherman firepower, that too many American tankers died because of bureaucratic decisions made far from the front lines. There's truth in this critique. The persistence of the 75mm gun, long after it was clear that heavier armament was needed, represents a failure of institutional adaptation. But it's also worth remembering that the same bureaucracy that kept Shermans undergunned also kept them supplied with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. It trained crews by the thousands, it shipped tanks across an ocean and maintained them in combat conditions. The American war effort was imperfect, but it worked. The war was won. And the men who fought it, who faced Tigers and their inadequate Shermans, who died by the thousands, made it possible. On the Eastern Front, the story was different, but no less bloody. Soviet tank losses were staggering. The Red Army lost approximately 96,500 tanks and self-propelled guns during the war, most of them against the Wehrmacht. Even after the IS-2 appeared, losses remained high. But Soviet production was even more staggering. Soviet factories produced over 108,000 tanks and self-propelled guns during the war. For every vehicle lost, more than one was built to replace it. This was the fundamental asymmetry that doomed Germany. The Tiger was a response to a problem that couldn't be solved. Germany was fighting enemies who could outproduce it by factors of 5 or 10 to 1. No amount of technological superiority could overcome such odds. Each Tiger destroyed took with it crew members who couldn't be replaced. Each Tiger lost meant factories had to build another, using materials and labor that were desperately needed elsewhere. Meanwhile, the Soviets and Americans could accept losses that would have crippled Germany. A destroyed T-34 or Sherman was a tragedy for its crew, but barely a statistical blip in the broader war effort. The Tiger's terror was real. The fear it inspired in Allied tankers was genuine and justified. But terror is not strategy. Fear is not victory. The Tiger remains one of the most famous tanks in history, studied by enthusiasts and historians decades after the war's end. Its silhouette is instantly recognizable. Its reputation endures. Yet this reputation obscures a more complex truth. The Tiger was effective in narrow circumstances: defensive warfare, long-range engagement, against enemies who couldn't match its firepower. In these situations, it was devastating. But warfare isn't fought in narrow circumstances. It's fought across entire continents, over years of sustained effort. It demands not just powerful weapons, but also logistics, production, training, and morale. In these broader terms, the Tiger was a failure. It consumed resources Germany couldn't spare. It required maintenance that Germany couldn't provide. It demanded skills that were increasingly rare among German crews. And when it faced an enemy designed specifically to counter it, the IS-2, its advantages evaporated. The Tiger terrorized Shermans because the Sherman was designed for a different war, a war of mobility and exploitation rather than armor versus armor. When the Sherman faced a Tiger, it was using a screwdriver to hammer nails. The Tiger became prey for the IS-2 because the IS-2 was designed for exactly this situation. It was a hammer designed to pound enemy armor until it cracked. Both outcomes reveal the same truth. In warfare, context matters more than specifications. A tank is only as good as the doctrine that deploys it, the logistics that sustain it, the crews that operate it. The best tank in the world is worthless if it can't get fuel, can't be repaired, can't be crewed by trained soldiers. The Tiger taught this lesson to everyone who encountered it, though different observers drew different conclusions. American planners concluded that tank design mattered less than they had thought. The combined arms and air power could compensate for weaknesses in armored vehicles. This influenced American tank design for decades, producing vehicles that prioritized reliability and transportability over raw combat power. Soviet planners concluded that heavy tanks had a place in modern warfare, but only as part of a balanced force. The IS-2's successors, the IS-3 and T-10, continued the heavy tank lineage, but the Soviets never again relied on a single vehicle type to dominate the battlefield. German planners, if they drew any conclusions at all, had no opportunity to apply them. Germany's defeat was total. Its military traditions were shattered. The lessons of the Tiger would be studied by others, not by the nation that built it. And the individual soldiers who fought in and against the Tiger? They mostly wanted to forget. The tank battles of World War II were not glorious. They were terrifying, chaotic, and frequently fatal. The men who survived them carried scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. When veterans were asked about their experiences years later, few spoke of their tanks with affection. They remembered dead friends, burning vehicles, the constant fear that the next shell would find them. The romance of tank warfare exists in books and films, not in the memories of those who lived it. This is perhaps the final lesson of the Tiger's story. War is not a contest between machines. It is a contest between nations, between systems, between ideas. The machines are tools, nothing more. The Tiger was an impressive tool, but it served a nation whose ideas were monstrous, whose system was ultimately unsustainable, whose war was waged for purposes that history has rightly condemned. The Sherman and the IS-2 were lesser tools in some respects, but they served nations that, for all their flaws, were fighting against that monstrosity. Their ultimate victory was not just a triumph of production or doctrine, but a triumph of something harder to quantify. Sergeant Walter Mitchell survived the war. He returned to Ohio, married his high school sweetheart, and worked for decades in a factory that had once produced Sherman tanks but now made civilian automobiles. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences. When asked about the Tigers he had faced, he would usually change the subject. But once, near the end of his life, he offered a reflection that perhaps captures something essential about the war and his place in it. "We weren't heroes," he said. "We were just kids who got sent somewhere terrible and did what we had to do to survive. The Tiger was a scary thing to face, but we faced it anyway. Not because we were brave, but because there wasn't any other choice. You did your job or you died. Most of us just did our jobs." He paused, then added, "The tank doesn't matter, really. What matters is the guy next to you, and whether you can count on him when things get bad. We could count on each other. That's how we made it through." Perhaps that's the real story of the Tiger Eye. Not the specifications of armor and armament, not the tactical doctrines and strategic decisions, but the human beings who fought inside and against it. Young men far from home, terrified and determined, doing what they believed they had to do. On both sides. That's the tragedy and the truth of it. The Tiger Eye remains a symbol of German engineering prowess, of technological ambition that reached beyond what was practically achievable. It represents both the heights of what World War II tank design could accomplish and the limitations of focusing on technological solutions to strategic problems. For the Shermans it faced, the Tiger was terror incarnate, a monster that seemed invincible and implacable. For the IS-2s it faced, the Tiger was a worthy opponent, dangerous but vulnerable, powerful but beatable. For the men who crewed it, the Tiger was a weapon of war that demanded everything they had and ultimately betrayed them, as all weapons eventually betray those who wield them in a losing cause. And for history, the Tiger remains a reminder that no weapon, no matter how fearsome, can determine the outcome of a war. Wars are won by nations, not by tanks. The Tiger terrorized Shermans because it was designed to fight a different kind of war than the one America was prepared to wage. The Tiger became prey for the IS-2 because the Soviets adapted, learned, and developed the tools necessary to counter it. Both outcomes reflect the same fundamental truth. In warfare, adaptability matters more than initial advantage. The Germans built a Tiger. The Allies built a world that could tame it. That's the story. That's what made the Tiger Eye terror for Shermans, but easy prey for the Soviet IS-2. Thank you for watching. If this video helped you understand a piece of history you didn't know before, please consider subscribing to the channel. We have many more stories like this one to share. Until next time.